And thank you everyone for joining me this afternoon. I'm very pleased to introduce the panel of distinguished product leaders I'm sharing the stage with today. I'd like to introduce each, and this panel is about customized to the customer, about serving delightful UI in B2B and B2C. So as I introduce each of the panelists, I'll voice over briefly a little bit of their B2C and B2B background. So we have Kate Brigham, who's VP of Product at Notarize. On the B2C side, she has over 10 years building online communities and tools for patients with life-changing health conditions at Patients Like Me, and 2 years on the consumer side of a two-sided marketplace for ordering catering online at EasyCater. On the B2B side, she has 2 years on the business side of a two-sided marketplace for ordering catering online, building tools for restaurants to manage their catering business at EasyCater, and then 1.5 years building tools for consumers, small businesses, and enterprise customers to get documents notarized online at Notarize. We also have Emily, who's Chief Product Officer at Embark Veterinary, 9 years at Wayfair on the B2C side, including more than 6 on the core e-commerce funnel. She's currently Chief Product Officer at Embark, a consumer products company that sells DNA tests for dogs. On the B2B side, it's really been primarily B2B2C, so building internal tools for merchandisers and logistics at Wayfair, and then for various customer segments, so interior designers at Wayfair, veterinarians and dog breeders at Embark. And Emily also serves on the customer advisory board of usertesting.com, which is the B2B firm. I'm also pleased to introduce Christina Fernandez. She's product at Facebook, so 6 years across Facebook and Wayfair building consumer experiences. And then on the B2B side, 3 years at Enterprise and SMB at GitHub and Physicians at Council, a health tech and genetic testing firm. And I'm also pleased to introduce Rachel, who is VP of Product at JobGet. On the B2C side, she had 2 years as product lead for a consumer travel tech startup. And then on the B2B side, she spent 5 years on B2B travel and spend management software and is currently VP of Product at Double Commit Marketplace, overseeing B2B and consumer product experiences. So we do have a prepared set of questions. I am curious for any questions from the audience. Please do use that Q&A tab. I'll keep an eye on it throughout. But I'll get the discussion started with our panel now. So first, how do you think about customer research versus user research in the context of B2B and B2C product design?
Got it. Should I kick it off?
Yeah, Kate, please.
All right. So when I think about it, I think really the short answer is customer research, or I kind of think of it as market research, really informs marketing, and it focuses on how to acquire customers. User research, on the other hand, I really think of as informing product design and development, and focusing a lot more on retaining customers. But I think it's a big question and worth digging into a little bit more, because this is an area where I've seen no small amount of confusion across multiple companies that I've worked with, especially between product and marketing. I think one of the big reasons is there's actually a ton of overlap between what each of those kinds of research is trying to sort of get at and understand, because in both cases, each of those different sort of functions want to understand the audience. To acquire them or to retain them, you need to know who they are, how many of them there are, what motivates them, what frustrates them, how they're tackling similar challenges now, like what their pain points are. So either of those teams can figure out how to focus their attention so you can add real value for these prospects or customers or end users. But I think really the big difference is just application. So like, what questions are you trying to answer with your research? So customer research, again, great for understanding addressable market, which segments to target. It's great to inform pricing strategies, buying behaviors. It's great for figuring out what that really powerful emotional hook is going to be. I think that's one of those real strengths of marketing. And then like, how do you reach them with it? User research, on the flip side, is definitely a lot more focused on how to turn those insights and findings into tools, products, sites, experiences, interactions that solve problems that help those people accomplish a task or answer a question, get from point A to point B. So, it's basically a better way to solve a problem that they have. And feel satisfied and engaged and successful while doing it. So they'll want to keep using it and coming back and not confused or sort of frustrated. So there's a huge Venn diagram of overlap for sure. But I think really the key differences are just application and kind of approach and focus. So again, customer research, super important for marketing and sales teams. user research, super important for product design and engineering teams in my experience.
Thanks so much. And Christina.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with all of that. I think where I would also add is on a couple of things. So when you think about customer research, I think it can also be really powerful for a product team to identify the really, really big problems. It's like, what should we be solving? Whereas the user research is like, how should we be solving it? And then answering the question, like, are we solving it, right? Like once we've built something, you can use that user research to kind of like answer the question. I also think the other big thing, if we're thinking about B2B, the difference between B2B and B2C here is that like you can do things like user research through testing and things like that at scale, potentially on the consumer side. And then in B2B, there's a couple of different spaces here where the customer might actually, in enterprise, the customer might actually be, you know, a sales team or basically a different kind of team than your actual user. So you need to be doing both things. You need to be like selling and how do you get it into the actual big enterprise, but then how do you create that experience that is usable and solves the problems of the organization? And those are really different questions, potentially, depending on where you are in the process.
Excellent point. And I'm curious, what kinds of research, either customer research, user research, and testing, do you do for B2B or B2C products? And Christina, you want to kind of unpack a little bit tactically there?
Yeah, sure. I think there's, at least in my mind, the most experience I've had is sort of like direct interviews on the B2B side. That's super common, especially with enterprise. When you have, like at GitHub, there wasn't a ton of customers, right? There was a few really, really big customers, and you can get in a room with them, get deep on their issues, and kind of like have those conversations. And then when you're thinking about a scale like Wayfair or Facebook, what you're really seeing in those cases is more like a survey. You can do surveys. You can still do interviews, and they're really powerful, but they may or may not align with the data. So you have to have like different tiers. You can do the customer interviews for insight, but then you also need to do surveys for like large scale data. And then potentially in the long run, some sort of test to kind of confirm that all of the hypotheses actually turn into what you kind of expected in terms of behavior and engagement and things like that. So I think that those are sort of the three big buckets I would think about. I don't know, yeah. Kate, do you have any other buckets there?
Yeah, no, I think I love the way you pointed that out, and I think that's important. And the thing that I would build off too is you want all of those kinds of research, and in many cases, it's great if you can actually have talk to the same people and get the same kind of insights, so you can put them all together and sort of compare and contrast and see if they still are showing you the same kind of insights. But when I think a little bit more and sort of unpack which one when, I think it really has a lot to do with the decision that you're trying to inform, as opposed to any particular kind of research being more relevant or not for any one given audience. So like when I think about testing, what makes A/B testing super powerful is when you, Christina, as you mentioned, have a large sample size or a big group of people, you can collect statistically significant results, so you can trust in it, hopefully in a fairly short timeline. And I think also have a pretty focused question to answer that's usually tied to some sort of a metric. Like, is this going to improve conversion rates, or will it lead to more clicks? And it's great for answering a question like which version of this page works better, which works both for B2B and B2C. I think same thing for usability testing. It's really great at helping you assess if somebody can confidently complete a task, or get through a flow without getting confused or stuck. So you kind of know, should we keep iterating, or can we sort of leave it where it's at? And that's totally relevant for B2B or B2C audiences too. Where I think, to Christina's point, sort of user or customer research helps more is if you need to be able to dig into people's thinking. So, if you're at the concept testing stage and you're not quite sure what the best direction to pursue is, or if you need to really dig into the why behind something and get at people's thinking, as to why would one approach maybe be preferable to another. You don't typically need to talk to a ton of people so long as they're fairly representative, because it sort of gives you the place to start, so you can then maybe do larger scale testing to validate if some of those initial kind of impressions were making sense. But I think where things get really interesting from a B2C versus B2B standpoint is kind of when it comes to how you talk to and target each one of those groups. Because I think from my experience in B2B and B2C, or at least B2C small business, so B to SMB, they often tend to look a lot alike. So the same person who's buying the product is also often the one who's going to be using it. But in the case of enterprise B2B, as Christina mentioned too, you've really got a third audience that you're sort of dealing with. You've got the buyer, who is often not the end user. And so they're going to have different needs, questions, sort of issues from the end user who's really trying to use the product. And so, what convinces a consumer or somebody in a small business to buy something usually has a lot more to do with like utility and experience and price, because they care about all those things. Whereas sort of the enterprise folks are definitely a lot more focused, in my experience, on things like ROI, security, reliability. Is it going to be hard to implement and train however large my sort of workforce is? Is it going to scale with us as a business? So they also care about the quality, they care about user experience, but they definitely have a different set of concerns. So you need different approaches to try to assess those areas of interest. So I think, all of the different kinds of research are relevant. You just need to make sure that the method matches your question and you're asking the right kind of audience for the right kind of feedback. So.
Absolutely. And I'm seeing some heads nod from other panelists as well. Rachel, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this subject. Oh, you're mute. Yeah.
Let me just come off mute. Yeah, I love all these thoughts so far. One thing, I would say I use this phrase bird dog. If you have like a German short hair pointer trying to find the bird that somebody is trying to capture, I always think of I like to bird dog weekly user interviews. So and frame this with the context that I've been at startups in my product career. But one of the things that I always push forward with my team is to get on calls with customers every week. I think it's one, obviously there's certain questions like we often ask ourselves, what do we want to learn this week? But the reason why I bring up weekly user interviews, when it comes to being a better product manager and a better product leader, is once you develop that habit as a team, you're not constantly trying to figure out how to go get those customer interviews, right? You just have this regular cadence of talking with customers. And, I'm not the creator of this. I think Teresa Torres, who's a pretty famous product discovery thought leader and coach, really drives forth this point of doing weekly user interviews. But so that's one thing I always say is figure out how to do weekly user interviews. And you're gonna, obviously these are qualitative conversations. So you want to have a learning point or a learning objective that you're trying to understand in those conversations. But I think even if you take a step back from that, as a product leader and as a product manager, just having that habit, it's kind of like working out. If you have that habit of weekly customer interviews, you're going to really avoid confirmation bias. You're going to build a product that serves your user because you understand them inherently better by talking to them every single week and understanding them. So you can think, oh, the fastest way to market is to just go build this thing. But then why is nobody using it? Why isn't it have the adoption that we want? Why isn't it actually solving the problem that we're trying to solve for? It may be because you are thinking you understand your customer, but you're not actually your customer, right? So I guess I'll just drive forth this point of, I'd really encourage everyone to try and set up weekly customer interviews and the systems that scale with a growing product team to do that. Because I think at the end of the day, you're going to create more customer value by really understanding your customer. But maybe I'll pass it over to Emily if you want to weigh in on this at all.
Yeah, sure. I was just going to say, you're not your customer, right? And I think weekly customer.
Oh, Emily, I think you're on mute.
Can you guys hear me?
Gotcha.
Okay. They help you really understand the mindset. I think for me, we do a lot of user research. We do sort of generative, what problem should we be solving or how should we solve this problem? We also do usability research. I think that's where, what I would say is the way I think about it is you have some objective and you have different tools in your toolkit, and it's about pulling out the right tool for the objective that you're trying to do. And so sometimes, particularly if you have scale or the engineering cost is low, just doing an A/B test might actually be, the easier way to get a strong signal about whether something is working. Sometimes, the cost of engineering something is really high, or you really want to understand qualitatively, what's going on in the user's mind. And so doing usability testing or doing interviews is going to be a better way to get at what you're trying to get at. In my experience, I've worked at B2C at sort of very large scale at Wayfair, and B2B more at very small scale, either small user subsets or kind of internal tools. And so for me, I've tended to use A/B testing more in B2C, and then sort of pilot or pre-post or more qualitative research in B2B. I think there have been some interesting kind of other interactions. So for example, one of my customers now are dog breeders, but it's actually very hard for us to A/B test with dog breeders because it turns out that the dog breeders all talk to each other. So the minute that we put a new feature in the experience for one dog breeder, like the next day it's all over Facebook and all the other dog breeders want to know, where that feature is and when they're getting it. And that's made it really hard for the company to sort of consistently A/B test for dog breeders. And so like sometimes you run into specific things like that make you have to rethink what's the specific tool that is going to get me the answer that I want, sort of the most unbiased way. The other thing I would say is that I've had, as Brianna mentioned, a lot of B2B2C experience, and that requires sort of multiple levels of research and understanding of second order effects that I think are really interesting. So for example, building merchandising tools at Wayfair, you want your merchandisers to have the ability to do complex things, and they want to do complex things. And if you ask them what they want more control and more complexity. But giving merchandisers the ability to do complex things often translates into complexity in your customer experience, right? And so you want to build tools for people that, enable them and empower them, but you also want to make sure that the end result is really strong for that customer at the end. Same thing, I've worked in supply chain with drivers and driver apps. We would print pieces of paper for drivers that would give them some instructions and sort of tell them what they were supposed to say to customers over the call. And, I remember the day I found out that a bunch of our drivers were taking pictures of those sheets and texting them to the customers. Texting the picture of our instructions, to the customer, right? Which was something that we hadn't anticipated, but was sort of an interesting research use case of this kind of B2B2C interaction and how that was, creating a different experience. Something that was actually easier for the business person in the middle was then creating maybe not the best customer experience.
Yeah. And I just one more. Oh yeah,
I just want to add like one thought. And I was watching the sessions this morning on customer success, and I think like it kind of led me to think through how one can do customer research or kind of connect with your customers in a more consistent way. And I think in B2B especially, like connecting with sales and customer success is like a hugely successful way of doing that. Like I think even at Council where we were doing genetic testing, I would just shadow some of the sales reps when they were working with physicians and like, oh, okay, you see the dynamics of the office and it's totally different than what you would expect in terms of like a consumer experience. And so they need different things. They need different kind of features and how you test and things like that. And they can be good partners in things like pilots, right? Like I think we did all of our pilots with our sales reps and kind of worked with them as well as customer success. So I think that's kind of an interesting aspect too, that in consumer, I've seen less, like you have less of a connection to people who are directly interfacing. So that's another thing to think about as well.
And that goes well with the question we just got in the Q&A from Chelsea. For those weekly customer interviews, Rachel, you mentioned, should it be the product manager or the customer success manager doing those interviews?
Yeah, I think back to what Christina was saying, I think there's an inherent opportunity not only to team build, right, by tag teaming that between customer success and product when it's on the B2B side, like definitely because they're the ones managing that relationship and they obviously want the best outcome for the customer. And so they want to be part of that conversation with you on the product side. But so I would say together, it's a really powerful combination on the B2B side. On the B2C side or the consumer side, I look to the product managers to really lead that if there's, a discovery question. However, we will also do prototype testing, like moderated prototype testing with design leading it. So it just depends. I think it's all like, oh, it depends. It's situational. It's context-based. That's what's so hard. Like we probably need to draw like, here's your toolkit. Here's the flow diagram of the decision-making to use which tool would be helpful. But I would say like, in any case, I want product as a product leader. I want product to be in those conversations, but they don't have to be the one leading it. So I would say, depending on what's best for the customer and what's going to get the end, information that you're going to use to then create more value for that customer, that's how I'd go about it. But I think the CS product manager combo is super powerful in the B2B side of things for sure.
So one other thing I'd add too is it's fantastic if you can have your engineers or the other people who are involved in building the solutions in those conversations, because the more firsthand experience everybody has, the more empathy they have for the people they're creating solutions for, and the more creativity that comes out of it.
So moving from research to the output from the research, and Emily, you started to touch on this a little bit, but how do you know once you've created the product, after you've done the generative work, how do you know if the product is well designed?
Yeah, I was thinking about this, in prep, and I think there are three kind of big buckets of things that I look for. And the first one, the big one, is, did you accomplish the outcome that you were trying to drive? Like, I'm very much a proponent of design for impact's sake, not design for design's sake. And so I think it's important that you know what outcome you're trying to drive before you design anything, before you design a solution. And it's easy to lose sight of that along the way. So I think, like, every time you're doing research, every time you're testing, do you know what you're trying to drive, and do you know what you're going to do? And that's the other kind of test for me as a product leader. When people come to me about, an A/B test or a test they want to do, it might be a user test, but, in the case of an A/B test, I'll ask them, if it wins, like, what are you going to do? Right. And they'll say, well, I'll roll it out and then I'll keep improving it. And then I'll say, well, if it's neutral, what are you going to do? And they'll say, well, I don't know. We like it, so we'll probably roll it out and keep improving it. And then I'll say, well, if it's going to lose, what are you going to do? They're going to say, I'm going to assume it's not good enough yet, and I'm going to keep improving it. And then I'm going to test it again. At that point, if your answer is you're going to keep going, you're going to prove it no matter what, then there's not much point in testing, right? At that point, you're trying to make a decision about, am I going to get money by rolling it out now or rolling it out later? But you're probably spending money to do that test and to use that traffic. And so for me, I think also looking for, along the process to know not just what outcome you're trying to drive, but kind of how the research, or the test or whatever that you're doing is going to inform the next step that you're going to take. The other two are really, I think, pretty straightforward. One is like fast and frictionless, right? It meets the bar of sort of usability. I shouldn't say frictionless in that there are certainly some experiences where you actually want to build friction in, but to stop people from, abusing your product. But that it's intuitive, it's easy to use. And then the last is that, it works for all your users. So things like accessibility or equitability, sort of for everyone. Those are really the things I look for when I'm thinking, is this well designed?
Great.
Could I piggyback on that one? So I love this. I was thinking about this morning, and I was thinking about, I don't know, I'm sure you guys have experience when you're in a flow state, if you will. When I think about a well-designed product, like really that obviously there's other things that come into play here for it being well-designed, but I really think about putting users in this flow state where they're just like moving effortlessly through your product. Sometimes there's good friction, as Emily mentioned, that's built into it to help create value for them. But really, like, it's almost as if they're moving through it intuitively. And the information, the context they need at the moments that they need it is available. They don't necessarily have to read something to understand how to use it. It naturally guides them to the next step to get to the endpoint that you want them to get to create value for them. So I just kind of go back to this like flow state mantra of that's what we want to put the customers in when they're using our product, because they're using our product for a reason, to achieve some goal, right? To create some value. And if we can help them do that in an effortless, intuitive way, then I think then the product, like the whole experience is well designed, which is really what we're talking about when it comes to like the product being well designed.
I kind of want to add to that too, both Emily's thought and this idea of like the smoothness, because we recently had a situation at Facebook where there was a pretty big challenge. We're trying to combine a couple of different behaviors and they don't go together well. And it creates like a really complicated, confusing user experience. So I think one of the biggest things we've been thinking about is simplicity. Like, how do we make that very, very simple, even though the back end on our side is very, very complicated? And the tool that we use to do that was jobs to be done. Like, I mean, and that's a really common kind of framework, but we just kind of put that at the top, like, are we doing X? Are we doing Y? And we come back to it almost every time we were trying to make a decision about, do we go with this complex behavior? Does it do this? can we cut this out? Those kinds of questions. And I think we're still probably going to end up with a in between where, because of the complexity, but it kind of has helped us in a lot of cases cut out features or cut out additional things that like additional complexity that we didn't need to kind of do our first version of the project. And then I want to plus one Emily's point around outcomes. Like if you don't, for me, it's like, did you drive the outcome that you wanted? Like that's at the end of the day, the thing that defines the success. And hopefully you can measure the outcome that you wanted, and hopefully you can like figure all that out. I think that's usually the harder part. But that feels like the most important thing.
Yeah, to build on what Christina said, though, I think I've seen my team struggle with that the most, and even in conversations with stakeholders, is how do you measure that flow state, or how do you measure that feeling of this is a great experience, I like using this product, I love this part of it. And so I think, we've looked at heart metrics, we've looked at SUS, we've looked at a bunch of different metrics over time. And honestly, in many cases, I think it's just a qualitative judgment of what good enough looks like. And that one's just hard to measure.
And I want to pick up on something else Emily mentioned, which was equitability. So how does diversity, equity, and inclusion play into your design and product strategy?
Yeah, I think I wanted to weigh in on this one. I definitely don't have all the answers here, but I think it's an important topic when we're talking about, designing products or bringing products to life for our customers. I think the thing, I go back to this, and this is kind of on my point about weekly customer interviews, and I often think about this at my current company, JobGet, where we serve the hourly job seeker and the people who employ them, the employers. But we know we know, like, I know I am not representative of everyone who's using our product. And so I think really thinking about that and starting from that place and realizing, different types of people will be using this products, right? Demographically, from an accessibility standpoint, from a race standpoint, all of these things come into play into how they would use our product. And so we really try to touch on that when we think about, okay, let's put this in front of different types of people, right? With different characteristics or different makeup, and like, let's see how it works for them, because it's easy for me to assume as a technically fluent person or as a product leader that anyone could move through this really easily, but that's not the case, right? And so if we start with that point that like, we know we're starting from this point of like, we are not representative of our users, then we build with that in mind, and we bring those people into the conversations, and we test things with them to make sure that it is serving, a larger set than just ourselves who are building the product. And I really think, we need to challenge ourselves to think beyond who we are, but also our natural communities, and say, okay, let's bring everyone into this because we are serving all of these people, and let's make sure we're actually doing that. So that's back to this outcome point of view, is not only are people reaching this outcome, but is everyone that we're trying to help create value for reaching this outcome, right? Because maybe there's just a certain subset of people that are reaching it, even though they may be large. Maybe it's, not equitable, maybe it's not accessible. And so I think just starting from the point of knowing that we are not representative of everyone is a really good starting point. And then, working to put things in place, a system in place to be able to hedge against that.
Yeah, I think the system is an important piece, because I think, what, like Kate said, there's a qualitative judgment about whether something is good enough. And I think one of the traps we can fall into is, we 80-20 things, right? And so it's like good enough for the 80 or the 90 or the 95% of users. And I think when it comes to, for example, accessibility, I think it's really important that you have the steps in your process where you say, okay, it's fine if it's, it's 95% of the way there, but it has to be really great for a certain set of users, right? And we can't just say, oh, well, they're not the majority of our customers, right? You have, and doing that step actually really helps your product be a lot better. I mean, for, as an example, right? If you have visually impaired users who are using a screen reader, it's really important that you have a tight site architecture, right? But it turns out that having a tight site architecture is really good for your product, right? And so I think there are ways to think about really improving your product by ensuring that you're designing for different types of customers who have different needs. That just makes your product better and easier to use for everyone overall.
I was going to add in about the systems because I completely agree. I think it's really hard to prevent things like bias from coming through when you aren't all of your customers, and there's no way that expectation like makes sense. So it's about the system. And so one example, I mean, this has definitely been written about on different places, but I think I've seen it work really well, which is actually like checking your algorithms, checking your systems for those biases. Like, hey, we don't think it would affect this group more or less, and actually having those groups there and kind of checking in to see how your algorithm, does it do something different? Is there a bias across different groups of people? And you can then kind of assess why and actually go into the root of a product and really understand, like, does it have kind of an inherent bias within it? And I think having that mechanism and that process in place means that no one's like responsible. You don't have to remember to kind of like go against that bias there. You can kind of work through it. And then when it arises, you tackle it and kind of resolve it. And I think that's really important. So not just like thinking about all those users, but actually having the way to check in that you're kind of serving them. And then I think like in product, this is less and less the case, but I think to Emily's point around the 80-20, like I feel like at the beginning of my career, I heard a lot of like, oh, that's just an edge case. We'll kind of like put it over there. And that idea of the edge case can be very dismissive. So I think then it becomes a way of like, what is your bare minimum for your edge cases that you're going to like, can they do, going back to the jobs to be done point, can they do the jobs to be done? Or are you actually like blocking people from doing the thing, right? You can still have potentially differences in experience across different groups or even with accessibility, but like, can they accomplish the thing that you wanted them to do? And if there's even a small portion of people who really can't and are completely blocked, then I think that isn't quite accepting that isn't quite acceptable, and you have to get there, I think is a big part of it.
Yeah, I love that. I love this idea of like a quality standard that you're talking about, right? And then how do you put a system in place throughout the product development lifecycle to be able to meet that standard? And like one very tactical one, right, is just in QA, testing it with a screen reader, right? And going through that flow. And so it's like implementing, and you want to even do it earlier than that, right? To design it with that in mind, to design the experience with that in mind. But there are checks that you can put in place to make sure you're reaching that quality standard. So I love, the systems of things make it easier to make sure you have quality across the board, for sure.
And just one more thing to add on to that from a system standpoint too, is I think you as a company and as a product team and an engineering team all have to step back and think about what are the product principles that we care about as an organization that we're going to make sure we implement. So if making sure that everyone has access to your product is critical to your company and your philosophy and what you're trying to build, it's important to set that as sort of an upfront goal and intention so that you can then think about what are the systems to put in place to support that. But it has to start with that fundamental belief that it's important enough to prioritize and put effort into, because sometimes it's expensive and time consuming, and there are other things that are easier to prioritize. So I think that principles first piece is important too.
Yeah, I love that. I found myself like wanting to give you a high five, but it's sort of virtual. Absolutely.
I appreciate it. Right back at you.
Yeah, this has been a really spirited chapter of our discussion, and I'm not surprised, but I think a lot of the themes that have to do with design in general kind of came out in this few minutes, just summarizing like this idea of humility, curiosity, having systems and high standards and like goal alignment across the organization. I think that is kind of good design principles in general that definitely comes out in this DE&I piece. So thanks for that. And speaking, I think, Kate, this is a great segue to the next thing we wanted to talk about, which was about that alignment. So in product, you are very cross-functional. You have lots of different groups of stakeholders, in addition to, of course, your customers and users. You can think of as stakeholders in some way, but engineering, technical teams, operations, marketing, sales. So can you say a little bit about how you work with these different groups of stakeholders and integrate them into the overall product vision?
You bet. This is a huge and really critical part of all of our jobs. I think as product leaders, if we can't work well with stakeholders, we don't work well. And I'll speak specifically to, I think, partnering with engineering and marketing, because those are two that are pretty close to my part. And I think, in an ideal world, sort of across all the functions and all the people you partner with, everybody's a great collaborator. And, everyone brings a unique perspective and skill set to the table that enriches the work everybody's doing and the perspective everybody has. But we're all humans and flawed humans. So there's usually a fair amount of negotiation and work that is required to sort that out and to kind of form and norm and storm and get those relationships in place. But a couple of things that I've seen work well over time, with engineers in particular, if you've got product-minded engineers, so the sort of engineers who are excited to actually kind of co-create and really, come up with and suggest and have ideas to bring to the table, like pull them in at the problem definition stage, include them in your research, let them hear from customers, work with them as you're trying to figure out what is the problem we're going to solve and what does success look like, because it's going to help them feel a lot more invested in the problem, probably have a lot of creative ideas. I know one of the favorite projects I think about in my Patients Like Me days, I had an idea and an engineer I was working with made it 10x better because of what he brought to the table. And I think if you can really sort of get everybody across functions involved, you can get just some real magic happening and some great ideas. So if you've got the product minded folks, definitely bring them in early. I think not all engineers are like that, and that's fine too. I think some are just like, tell me what to build and I'm going to crank it out, and you need those kind of people too. So I think, in those cases, it's really just getting to know who your engineers are and respecting that some like to get pulled in early and some are less excited to do that, and enabling all of them to I think, work with you in whatever way is going to sort of work best. But for the ones who are less interested in getting involved up front, I think it's, what do they need to understand your vision and to care about it and to buy into it and feel like it's worth doing and building. And it might be having a really clear metric. It might be just sort of, walking them through sort of what and why and how you think this solution is really going to help. So I think for them, it's making sure they understand it. Engineering aside, when it comes to marketing, there is always tension between product and marketing, even if we don't want there to be. But my experience is sort of it exists. So it's good to just know about it up front. But if you can get that relationship to work well, it can be absolutely magical. So when I was at Patients Like Me, a woman named Lori Scanlon was my marketing partner there, and she was amazing. I loved working with her. We had some of the best collaborations. So may you all find your Lori Scanlon in the world. It is just wonderful and breathtaking. But I think the thing that I really value about marketing, and part of what I think helps me engage with them, is just because we build it does not mean the users will come. Marketing is really good at telling people about what you've built and why it matters to them and how it's going to help them. So you guys can focus on building something awesome, and they can focus on making sure the right people know about it. And so I think if both teams can really come together and think about it from that standpoint, that's really where just fantastic things can happen. And so even just starting and remembering, we need each other, and then partnering that way is definitely kind of what I've seen work well. And then I think, last but not least, all of us who are involved in building anything. But I think certainly people who build technology products and people I've worked with in the Boston startup scene, we all want to build something meaningful that makes a difference and that makes, our users' lives better and hopefully maybe the world a better place. And, I think if we can figure out ways as groups to come together and really understand the why behind what we're doing and figure out how we can each bring sort of some part of our expertise to the table to work together to get it out there, then we all get to celebrate at the end of it too. So I think it's worth putting in the time and effort, but also worth recognizing it takes time and effort because it's people relationships, which are often harder than technology problems to solve.
And you mentioned there's always a little tension between product and marketing. Where do you feel, we had a question from the audience, kind of what skills are most important in marketing? I'm curious, where do you see kind of product's lane and marketing's lane in that relationship?
So one place I've seen a real challenge it doesn't quite answer the skills of what's most important in marketing. But actually, for a while, had my team report up to marketing. And a challenge I saw happen is my marketing leader never really understood what it took to build software. So he was constantly frustrated by how long things were taking, by the fact that he couldn't get a really clear answer in the way that you could, sort of test things in marketing. So there was just a lack of understanding. In part, I think another thing, we did a big rebrand, and we, came up with this gorgeous new design, and it was fantastic for campaigns, but it didn't translate well into the UI. So I think it's really sort of understanding, like, what does the product do? What's going to work in the product? What is marketing trying to do? And sort of what's going to work in a marketing space, and just recognizing they're not always the same. So I think, we talked about this with research early on. There's some different questions to ask. I think they're just different areas of focus that we each have, different processes that we go through. So it's a little bit of like, learn about the other's space and field and how they work. And, hopefully with some sort of respect, in a sense that like, that's different than how we do it, but interesting and equally valid.
So on that, thank you. And on that, kind of working with different groups of stakeholders, Christina, did you have some thoughts you wanted to share too?
Yeah, I think what I've noticed, and maybe this is more of like a general observation, I think product managers have a couple different strategies and different personality groups types. And one of them falls into like what I call the brilliant product manager with the brilliant ideas. It's like, we're going to do this crazy thing and kind of like pushes that through. But I think that what's a lot more sustainable, and there are people who have that, but what I've seen be much more sustainable and repeatable is creating structure to bring out the best ideas from the team. And where you kind of like, it's not, that idea may or may not be the product managers, right? But I think that like there's a structure in which you say, okay, well, this is our goal. This is how we're doing this. This is what's important to us. And then you create like the check-ins, the brainstorms, the like connections, the readouts, the like all the kind of like different pieces of the process to bring people along kind of like on what you're learning and bringing out ideas. I recently joined a new team a few months ago, and we were kind of tasked with, kind of on the back burner was like, create a new strategy for this team. And it's a deeply technical area. It's a platform team within Facebook, and it kind of spans like a huge area. And really, like, I wasn't the best person, for example, to say like, okay, here's what we're going to go do after like a couple weeks of knowledge. And so a lot of what I spent time doing was like, how do we do research? How do we bring people along? How do you have the engineers come and present their ideas, the designers, if that's relevant, have customers like share their perspective and kind of like use that framework to come up with that new strategy. And so I think that when you think about everybody as like a source of ideas and you agree on the framework on how to decide which is like what should come to the top, then there's a lot less disagreement, at least from the product development side. I think what Kate was describing was like, how do you launch the product? How do you make the product, right? Like it depends on kind of like what stage you're in, because maybe, but either way, I think like when you kind of expand the group of people whose ideas you're bringing in, that can be very, very powerful. When it becomes like a very big group of people, the structure and how you do it is probably the most important thing, because having 10, 20 people in a room throughout ideas is not going to be productive, but you can add the structure. You can kind of go through the steps to really get to a place where people felt like their ideas were heard, and then potentially their ideas were kind of like floated to the top. And I found that to be really empowering, really special. And you build a different kind of relationship with people when you don't just say like, hey, good idea, and you bring it in, but like you bring them into the process.
Yeah. Emily, I know you had some thoughts on working with engineering specifically.
With operations specifically.
Oh, operations specifically.
Yeah, so I mean, I would just echo what people have said, that I think having understanding and mutual respect for other functions is critical. So working effectively with them, right? Everybody has a goal. Everybody's motivated by different things. They're all trying to solve problems, and all for the betterment of your company and your customers. And PMs and designers are great at understanding people's motivators and problems and goals. So like apply the skills that you have as product managers and designers to understand what the people in your company are trying to accomplish. I guess I would also say, like, go work in those functions if you can. I have experience in both supply chain operations, doing inventory planning, and in merchandising. And some of the product leaders that I have most enjoyed working with and, you know, most respect and follow have moved from product or sort of development research roles into COO or, like operational roles and back, over the course of their career. Very specifically in supply chain, that is what like a data, someone working in data might call a human in the loop problem, right? So it's not that you're designing technology or designing human process. You have to design a supply chain together. Like otherwise you're creating one of these problems where you've like solved a local maximum while missing the potential like actual maximum. You can design great technology and then you have to build operations to fit around the technology. And you can design operations and then build technology to fit in those operations. Neither of those is usually the best solution. The best solution is when you design the human process and the technology to go hand in hand. And so any case where you have human beings who are your users and you have access to them, like really try to design with them. That's also critical to adoption and feedback and long-term success. The other thing that I've learned as an operator and as a PM for operators is that those people will work around your tools if they don't meet their needs. I've seen users do an untold number of creative things. And so, in those cases, I felt it was really important to be even more plugged in, than just to your sort of average stakeholder. And then we talked about this a little bit, but in supply chain, there is no such thing as an edge case. A box that gets left on a floor somewhere becomes another box that gets reordered. And then if you have the same problem you had the first time, now you have 2 boxes sitting on your floor. And then you have 3, and then you have 4. And so we had a saying in the group that I worked on that was, edge cases are first-class citizens. And so that was something that was uniquely different about working in supply chain than working in, consumer experience, where you really you learned to develop for the edge case. And then the last thing I was going to say is just that, operators are often the people closest to the customer. So customer service is the one that's going to get a question about some new feature that you put on your website. For me, the driver was literally the only Wayfair employee who ever came face to face with our customers, except maybe the few people who visited our store in the Natick Mall. But that's like an amazing opportunity to reinforce your brand and your product experience, to think about what are those interactions with service and with operations, and are they kind of reinforcing your product principles and kind of the experience that you want your customers to be having.
And thank you. And Rachel, you had something I thought was super interesting about Intel here.
Oh, yeah, I'm a former Army officer, so that weighs into my life in many ways, even if I didn't want it to. But one of the things I think often about is collecting intel. And what I mean by that is, you're having interactions with stakeholders and you're gathering data or intel, if you will. So one of the things I do that may be helpful for others is I create like an internal CRM, right? Where I have like, obviously people are segmented by like marketing or customer success, and there's general things and motivators that I know about those teams. But then there's also specific to that individual, right? That I keep notes of so that I understand that context, or I have that intel going into those conversations. And I leverage that really to put forth this team first mindset of like, hey, I want you as my stakeholder to feel seen, heard, and understood, right? Like all those 3 things. Christina, you touched on this when we were talking about this, really understanding those people, and then Emily and co-creating together. But so I do that. It's super helpful for me, just because I think it's one thing if you know it and you like can kind of reference it, but like writing it down and seeing it and updating it as I go through has helped me to like really build relationships, because at the end of the day, we're only going to be successful if we go to market together for our customers, right? So if I can understand these people and how to leverage that information going into conversations, or even know when to bring them in, because there's like something they really, really care about. And if I don't bring them in, there's going to be friction, you know what I mean? Like beyond, even if we get it like spec'd out, there's going to be friction in the go-to-market because they're going to have a lot of questions. So knowing different people's motivators, or desires or outcomes and goals they're striving for, but then also, I just use it at like a department level to kind of understand, like generally bucket people and then specifically go into details for each person. So that's my intel gathering, I guess, little point that I like to weigh in on.
Awesome. And we are getting close on time. We have a couple of questions from the audience. So I'd like to tackle those before we go to our last question. On the subject of working cross-functionally with others, how do you share the learnings from user research with other team members?
So I'm happy to take this one, at least from my experience. I think there are a lot of ways that you can do this, day to day. So for example, we have a weekly Wednesday morning meeting, product and design, and we have time there just for people to share things that they've learned, right? And so that's a way that someone who, maybe was doing user interviews the week before can just bring sort of a highlight of something that they heard or something they've learned. I think that's more sort of the ongoing, right? You make talking about what you've learned and the research that you've done part of your, whether it's your all hands meeting or team meetings or those kinds of things. I think your question specifically says new employees, which makes me think a little more about like, how do you manage research insights over time? And to be honest, I don't have a great answer. I think this is a challenge everyone faces of kind of institutional knowledge and memory. I know, one of the things I've seen, for example, the research team at Wayfair basically had, an Airtable. So like a document where they would track what research was done, where the documents or artifacts from that research was, what kind of core outcomes or learnings were, maybe what the specific goal or learning objective of that research had been or the context for it, and some other information so that people, and then there was some tagging, right? And so people who were specifically looking for research that had been done on a specific topic or a particular part of the website, had a resource that they could go back to. But it was still, I think, then a lot of work to go through and read those documents and things.
Yeah, we did something similar at Patients Like Me, and having that sort of resource that's searchable was super helpful. A couple other things, we actually had an entire wall that was filled up with our personas and with the patient journey and with the key questions that people asked. And just having that up all the time as a reminder, I think was really helpful. It was actually something when, people would come in to visit the office, we'd walk them through and talk them through. We also used to do some sort of guerrilla kind of things, like we'd take quotes from patients, done this in a couple of places, and actually put them up at the coffee maker or put them up in the bathroom and just put them in places so people would be reminded of what folks were saying. So I think just kind of integrating it into daily things. At EasyCater, we had a newsletter that the research team put out, and they'd share quotes. I think the quotes in particular often got people a lot more than the sort of synthesized research findings. So I think if you want to try to grab people and really get them to remember them, quotes with photographs or even little video clips are often a lot more powerful, because second order research just isn't as impactful as listening to somebody yourself.
Thank you. And Christina.
Yeah, I was going to say, quick thing. I think across the different points of my career, I've seen doing a short user interview at the beginning of every weekly meeting, something similar to what Emily was talking about, but having that be a fixed part of the agenda is really an interesting idea. And then the other thing we did on another team, which was really effective, is we made it kind of a funny presentation about mistakes that we'd made, or what we called it is the learnings of all the things that we wanted people to kind of be hey, we made these mistakes already, let's not make them again. It's not quite exactly. Some of it was research, some of it was just we ran a test and it was a terrible idea, that kind of thing. And it was kind of a funny thing. And we would do a presentation to all new team members, and it was really fun, a way to build. And we would reminisce about weird bugs and things that happened and why they'd happened. I think that was really powerful to kind of bring people into the mentality of where the team is at a specific point.
So
hi, James. 5-minute warning.
Yes, got a couple minutes left. I don't know if you guys have any closing thoughts you want to end with.
Yeah, I think our last question was really, the theme of this panel is to serve delightful UI in B2B and B2C. And so what advice would you give to a PM considering a pivot from one to the other?
Who do you want to start with?
Go for it, Kate.
All right. So I think I've done all of them, and I would say try them all. The best way to figure out what's a good fit is really to give them a try. Don't forget that small business and B2C are often fairly similar, but enterprise B2B is really a different beast. I think if you really like to learn fast and you like metrics informed work. B2C might be your sort of happy place. If you really like sort of peeling back the layers of the onion and getting really deep and understanding different sort of users and user types, and you're okay with waiting a little longer for results, B2B might be your happy place, or enterprise B2B, but try them all. There's lots of interesting stuff to learn.
Oh, Emily, you go ahead first.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I, very similar to Kate, would just say, like, it's always great to learn new things and to challenge yourself to learn new things. And I think anybody who's considering a pivot should feel like they're going to learn really interesting things from being on the other side of the house. You know, what I look for when assessing a job is like great people, interesting problems, and personal growth, the 3 Ps I call them. Which you can find no matter what kind of product. You know, I would say Kate had a very positive spin on this, but I was thinking about what are challenges that I've seen with PMs who kind of want to make the move, but maybe are having trouble making the move. I think going into B2B, learning to work with a sales force and learning to roadmap when you have kind of customer relationships or preset launch dates or kind of other commitments. Those are skills that, you know, can be really important in some B2B products. Going to B2C, I think certainly, you know, A/B testing at scale for some of the larger consumer companies, you're not understanding statistics, right? And your comfort with doing that. And then also the comfort with continuous delivery. You know, I've seen that for folks who are moving from a B2B role that's like either a little bit more waterfall or just has a preset kind of launch cycle. Moving to continuous delivery can be hard. And, you know, those are maybe some things to consider or to look into learning more about before you make a jump.
Yeah, I'll add in, I think taking stock of what, you know, if you are in a B2C company and you want to move to B2B, why, right? Like always going back to like what's motivating that. Like obviously, you know, I think trying them all is a really good experience, but I think also saying what are my strengths and what experiences have I had and how did I like those experiences? I think, you know, as you move to B2C, you can obviously run a lot more tests because you have a much larger user base and it's less about opinion, right? And you can like test things really quickly. But then in the B2B world, there's a lot of people involved in that sales process and that go-to-market process. And so there's a lot more influencing and collaboration taking place. Not to say it doesn't happen in the B2C world, it does, but it's a little bit different experience there. So I would always go back to like, who are you? What are your strengths? And what's giving you energy in your job as a product manager, and then putting yourself in a position to really leverage those strengths and that energy, and not necessarily saying, oh, I need the B2B experience if you've like been in B2B and just be like, I don't like it, you know, or on the flip side, the consumer side. So I'd really go to where your strengths and your energy lead you. But first that starts with like understanding and taking stock of those things and being honest about it with yourself, and then putting yourself in a position to really succeed for your team, right, and for your customer.
And Christina, 5 seconds.
Yeah, I think I was just thinking about the consumer experience and, oh, I'm out of time. Never mind. No worries.
I'm so sorry.
No, it's fine.
Sorry, Christina. I took too much time.
No, it's totally okay. I tried to do it in 5 seconds, but I couldn't.
Go ahead. I think we're still on.
Oh, we're still on. Okay, no, that's fine. Yeah, I think like for me, the height of it is that like, I love consumer stuff, but one of the challenges when you're doing a lot of B2B tests or you're working with like thousands and thousands or millions of users at a distance, I think you can get really distant from your customer and like the nitty gritty of what they're experiencing. And so that's just like something I noticed. I used to be a chemist, so the scientist in me like loves the B2C data aspect. But then when I did B2B for the first time, like I loved like being able to interview, go on the sales calls, and like that depth is just like really different. So I don't know, they're both kind of special in their own way. But I agree, Rachel, with what you were saying about going to your strengths. I think that really spoke to me as well.
All right. Well, thank you, Brenna, Christina, Emily, Kate, and Rachel. It was a great session. So we have more content coming up today and throughout the week. So be sure to click on the agenda at the top of the screen, check it out, and we'll see you soon. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.